In total, you have about 1 million, but the problem is that the number of these people that started using sedatives also started using tranquilizers and the other way around. And this is looking at the long-term trend from 1965, so this is all the data that's available in terms of the initiation of tranquilizers or sedatives. And back here from the mid-60s through the mid-80s, there wasn't a whole lot of difference between the number of people that were starting to use tranquilizers versus sedatives. But by the early 90s, you have a marked difference. And then through the mid-90s to the early 2000s, you have the number of people using tranquilizers, which are benzodiazepines, increasing rapidly. And the number of people using barbiturates or sleep aids doesn't change much. And then through the mid-2000s, through about the beginning of the pandemic, 2019, you have a slow increase in the number of people using benzodiazepines. And then in 2019, 2020, and 2021, the number of people dropped using tranquilizers or benzodiazepines. And also the number of people here using sleep aids or barbiturates seem to go down, at least in the most recent data point for 2021. And then again, this is from 2015. But this is looking at the age distribution of people who started using one of these prescription drugs. And we're specifically interested in the tranquilizers and the sedatives. And you can see that it's later in life that people start using tranquilizers or sedatives, either one. The vast majority of people that are starting to use are 26 and older. And this gives the average age at which people started to misuse a tranquilizer or a sedative. And 26 years for tranquilizers, which are benzos, and almost 28 for people that are misusing sedatives, which are either sleep aids or barbiturates. And looking at past month substance use, you've got tranquilizers or sedatives at 1.4 million very faithful users of one or the other or both. And when it comes to the number of people, it's kind of funny that they put this in illicit drug use, but I guess you can get a tranquilizer or a sedative from other than a doctor. But anyway, so it's ranked amongst the people using illegal drugs, and this is looking at past year, and there were about 5 million people that used or misused rather a tranquilizer or a sedative in the last year. And that's part of this 20% of people that have used or misused rather a illegal drug. Then when you look at prescription psychotherapeutics, have not used one, about 55% of the population, have used one in the last year, about 44% of the population. So of those, there's a fairly large number of people that have used a tranquilizer or a sedative. And this is not misusing, this is just who's using them. In people that are 12 and older, you have about 40 million people using a tranquilizer and 18 million using a sedative. And then we go to misusers. So in the last year, roughly 7% of the population misused a psychotherapeutic. Most of them were misusing a pain reliever. But we do have 6.1 million and 1.5 million misusing a tranquilizer or a sedative. So then I was looking at as much information as I could find. The data only goes back to 1985. Much of the problem with doing epidemiology on drug use here in the United States is the further back you go, the less information you have. And it's not just because people were keeping records on paper and not in a computer, but it's also because there wasn't as much interest in knowing who was doing what back then. It was only with the advent of computers and statistics back in the 60s that there became any interest in the public health in terms of what drugs were being used by whom and in what amount. And that's what, at least in part, brought about the Controlled Substances Act in 1970, was the fact that people started to recognize that looking at the epidemiology of this could both help to alert the authorities to the fact that there might be a problem before it became evident. Because prior to the Controlled Substances Act, the vast majority of prosecutions were because of some story in the popular press about misuse or mismanagement of patients. So it had to become an issue in the news, basically, before the DEA or FDA or any of these other regulatory bodies would have anything to do with it. But with the advent of modern statistics and computers, they started getting better and better information. And it wasn't until very recently, like within the last 5 years, that more than 90% of drug-related deaths actually specified which substance was involved, which to me is baffling why it would take that long. But the vast majority of the time, I guess the medical examiner or the coroner doesn't have a lot of time to try and figure out why the person died or which drug was involved, or drugs for that matter, and they just put it down as drug-related and on to the next one. But anyway, so this is looking at, have you ever used a tranquilizer? And they stopped collecting that data in about 2014 because of measurement issues, they said. And have you used a tranquilizer in the last year or the last month? And so this is a trend from 1985, which is the most, the furthest back that data goes. So obviously tranquilizers, or most likely these were sleep aids back there in the mid 80s, were misused. And then the number of people misusing dropped considerably during the late 90s and then rebounded actually really fast around 98 to 2002 for some reason, right in here. And the number of people per year went up a bit during that period, and the number of people per month increased as well. The numbers of lifetime users through the end of measurement were increasing for tranquilizers. And in this period, I'm pretty sure that the majority of these people are misusing a benzodiazepine. The number was pretty steady in terms of the number of annual users, at about 2% of the population. that is, of people 12 and older. Recently, in the pandemic, the number has gone down. So you got 2019, 2020, and 2021, and the number of monthly users has gone down as well. So we'll see whether it's just a blip because of the pandemic or if it actually holds. Hopefully it holds, because if you add sedatives, then those are in green here, the tranquilizers are in red, then the lifetime number of users decreased since the mid-80s. And it rebounded here in the same period, and then it was on a slow decline. Most likely a generational thing, because barbiturate users are dying off, and physicians aren't prescribing barbiturates very much. The number of annual users of sedatives, number of monthly users of sedatives are both lower than the monthly users of tranquilizers. So a small number, less than 1% of the population, on the order of 1/10% by 2021. And then finally, they did add a category specifically for benzodiazepines, but they only added that as of 2015. So of the people that are using, they also added this category, either a tranquilizer or a sedative. Of the people that are using a tranquilizer or a sedative, the vast majority of them, here in blue, are using a benzo. So that means the vast majority of them are using a tranquilizer. And that's this number in red. Tranquilizers, here's the number of people using a benzodiazepine. And then down here is the annual number of people monthly using either a tranquilizer or a sedative. So these are the ors, either one. And you can see that they are closely followed by the annual and monthly number of tranquilizer misusers. So almost all of the people that are misusing one or the other group are misusing a tranquilizer. And almost all of those people are misusing a benzo. So that's the take home from this information anyway. Although the number of people misusing it is on the decline, the vast majority of people are misusing a benzodiazepine. And it represents currently about 1.5% of the population. So the most recent graph in terms of age trends for either misusing a tranquilizer or a sedative shows that the majority of people in the past year that misused one were in the age group of 18 to 25. And that was about 4%. So then this is looking at the age distribution of past year prescription tranquilizer or sedative misuse compared to stimulant misuse or pain reliever misuse. So this is the one that we're concerned about today. And this is recent data. So as of 2021, still, the majority of people that are misusing one in the past year is in the 18 to 25 group. And I guess overall, it doesn't matter whether it's 12 or older or 26 or older, the rate is still about 1.7% of the population. So then this is older data from 2015, looking at the age distribution of any psychotherapeutic pain relievers, tranquilizers, or sedatives. So it doesn't matter whether it's tranquilizers or sedatives, it's still mostly in the 18 to 25 group. And then looking at gender differences between guys and girls. For tranquilizers and for sedatives, the rates are similar, but there's slightly more guys using benzos and slightly more women using sleep aids. And then this is misuse versus appropriate use of a psychotherapeutic in general in the population. So you have a total in 2015 of about 120 million people that used some type of psychotherapeutic in the last year. Of that, 16% of them misused it. And then we're concerned primarily in this section with the people that were using tranquilizers or sedatives, and you have a misuse rate for tranquilizers of 15%, for sedatives it's 8%. So roughly on a percentage basis, of people that use a tranquilizer, they're about twice as likely to be misusing it as a sedative. And the number of people that are actually using one is roughly twice the number. So there's twice as many people using tranquilizers, and of those people, they're roughly twice as likely to misuse one as a sedative. So here's a fun graph. And the point of this graph is simply that people rarely misuse a tranquilizer in red or a sedative here in green in isolation. In fact, the isolated tranquilizer or sedative user almost doesn't exist. Because here's the number of people that use alcohol that also use a psychotherapeutic. It's almost 50%. Of that, about 10% of them are misusing a psychotherapeutic. About 15% of people that use alcohol are using a tranquilizer as well. And about 8% are using a sedative. And then this is the number of people that are actually misusing one. So you'll note, as you go from alcohol to cigarettes, then marijuana, inhalants, hallucinogens, and then what are considered the hard drugs, you have a constant theme here that people are more and more likely to use and abuse tranquilizers and sedatives as you go along this, I guess, spectrum of a drug that almost everybody uses to a drug that almost nobody uses, but the very most devoted, quote, junkies. So the vast majority of heroin users, about 93%, use some type of psychotherapeutic, and almost 80% of that 90%, or 80% of these users rather, are misusing a psychotherapeutic as well. So once you get to heroin users, almost all of them, 9 out of 10 are using a psychotherapeutic, and 8 out of 10 are misusing one. All right, then when it comes to substance use disorder, the reason I left this in here is because you won't find tranquilizers or sedatives in isolation as a disorder. Generally speaking, it's some other drug that people are primarily receiving their treatment for, And in addition to having this problem, they may also have a problem using a benzodiazepine or a barbiturate or a sleep aid. And that's what this graph represents, is that almost everybody who uses one of these drugs also uses a psychotherapeutic. So the majority of people get diagnosed with one of these drug disorders and not a psychotherapeutic, even though they're using them. So this is looking at substance use disorders for the psychotherapeutics and just showing you why it's not on that other graph. The number of people that are diagnosed is roughly 1% of the population. For tranquilizers, it's roughly 1/3%. And for sedatives, it's roughly 1/10%. So compared to these numbers are diminishingly small. And then of the people that have a substance use disorder for one of these prescription psychotherapeutics, in what age group are they? For tranquilizers and for sedatives, the majority are in this 26 and older age group. Both. And then this is looking at prescription psychotherapeutics for which the most recent treatment was received. And pain relievers actually represents a fairly large number of people who receive treatment, but tranquilizers and sedatives are a small percent, 8% and 3%. And then this is looking at the difference between people with depression and without depression in the youth age group of 12 to 17. And as you might expect, people with depression are much more likely to abuse or misuse a psychotherapeutic, twice as likely, or actually more than twice as likely for pain relievers, more than twice as likely for tranquilizers, and almost, 2.5 times as likely for sedatives. So both sedatives and tranquilizers are about 2.5 times more likely to be misused by people with depression. Use with depression.
Online class.
And this is looking at adults 18 and up with depression. Same idea, tranquilizers and sedatives, except this is 4 times as likely, and so is this. So, instead of being 2 times as likely, it's 4 times as likely for adults with depression. And this is looking at the rates versus mental illness. None, acute mental illness, or severe mental illness. And once again, not too surprisingly, tranquilizers and sedatives are much more abused or misused by people with either acute or severe mental illness. This one is on the order of, 6 to 7 times. And that one is as well for people with severe mental illness. And given that people that are depressed and have mental illness preferentially misuse tranquilizers, sedatives, pain relievers, and stimulants, it's not surprising that people who have suicidal ideation or thoughts of suicide are much more likely to misuse. This is 5 times more likely. And so is that, only it's more like 4, but you get the idea. So people, I'm not saying that suicide causes people to use tranquilizers and sedatives. I'm saying that the same people who have depression and acute mental illness or serious mental illness also often have thoughts of suicide. So it's not surprising that the rates of misuse are much higher amongst people with those issues. So then this is just kind of summarizing the whole thing. In this young person age group, let me try that again. You have a relatively low level of misuse of about 5% and a level of use of about 28%. And the majority of that is amongst people with depression. You can see that when you don't have depression and you're in this age group, the level of misuse is a bit lower. For people with depression, the level of misuse and use are higher. And then for adults in the age group of 18 and up, the level of use and misuse is higher. And then for people with acute mental illness, but not serious mental illness, acute mental illness of any type, serious mental illness, depression, or thoughts of suicide, you can see that rates of use and misuse are much higher for all categories, whether it's a psychotherapeutic in general, a tranquilizer, or a sedative. And then looking at monitoring future, they have tranquilizers, which are generally the benzodiazepines. The rate of use back to 1975, all the way up to 2022 for seniors, and then for 8th and 10th graders from 91 on. And that same trend, higher back here in the mid-70s through the early 90s, trending down, and a trend back up through the early 2000s. And then from there, it's been trending down. And during the pandemic, it's gone sharply down. Small rebound recently, but it's on the order of 2%. For sedatives/barbiturates, same trend, much higher in the mid-70s, trending down, up, and back down. And right now it's on the order of 2.5%, 3%. So the other thing to keep in mind when it comes to the epidemiology of sedatives, tranquilizers, whether you're talking specifically benzodiazepines and barbiturates, is that people with a substance use disorder in the United States have a rate of benzodiazepine misuse that's between 3.5 and 24 times higher than the general population. So if you have any type of substance use disorder, your chances of using a benzo are much higher. And the misuse of other substances is most consistent and robustly correlated with benzodiazepine misuse. In fact, it is unclear how frequently benzodiazepine misuse occurs in isolation. Well, they estimated it to be on the order of 0.5% of the population. Rather, it's usually part of a polysubstance use pattern, which is very common these days. In fact, when they were doing this assessment in 2018, 63% of opioid deaths were not opioids alone. They were opioids in association with cocaine, 1/3 of the time, and benzodiazepines, 1/3 of the time. And then also to refer back to what Dr. Herzberg's point was, at least one of his points, and that was the massive amount of use of sedatives in the early to mid 1900s. The actual amount of sedative use up until it was scheduled in 1970 was increasing at a very rapid rate. And so was the amount of people that were dying of sedative overdoses or barbiturate overdoses, and that's something that is addressed in the lecture. There's actually better data from some countries in Europe, including the United Kingdom, regarding that. But the number of people that were dying per day or per 100,000 people in the population was actually greater than the number of people until probably recently that were dying of opioids. So there was a definite epidemic of barbiturate overdose that is equivalent to the opioid overdose that we're experiencing right now back in the 60s and late 50s, early 70s. So this is again making that point that as of 2020, the number of people that were using an opioid and a benzo was on the order of 11,000 deaths. And at that time, there were only about 70,000 overall opioid-related overdoses. So a little over 1 in 7 of those opioid overdoses were involved with benzo as of 2020.